Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm Heather Gatney, and I'm the coordinator of the CVFS webinar series. This is our first webinar of the year. It is one of 6 webinars that we have planned this time around for the series. And you can find descriptions of all of the upcoming webinars up on our CVFS website, so please check those out. Our host today is Bill Axon, Research Professor at the Population Studies Center and Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan. Bill is going to present new CVFS research using the 2016-2018 lifetime mental health history data for intergenerational research. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation. We ask that you remain muted until then. During the Q&A, you may raise your hand to ask a question, or you can submit a question at any time today using the chat feature. We'd also like to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to view from the CVFS website. The slides will also be posted there after the webinar. So now, Bill, I think it's
Heather, quick signal check with you. I found, I believe, 4 places where I thought I would stop and ask for questions of clarification. And I'm just, it's so great to see all of you here. I appreciate it very much. I'm just saying questions of clarification to differentiate that from a more general discussion. We would like to leave time at the end for a general discussion, so I don't want to burn too much time on that. But Heather, is that okay if I stop those 4 times and just totally. Emma, I'm quite relieved to see you here. I'm going to get to some models where some of those questions of clarification may require your input. Okay, let me start the slideshow. Let me minimize the box so I can. Okay. Thank you, Heather. Thank you all for being here. Today we want to talk about parental mental health and children's timing of marriage and childbearing. I want to send a special thanks to Emma Banchoff, Kate Scott, Dirga Gamiri, and Stephanie Chardul, all of whom provided some of the work that I will be reporting on today. Okay, that didn't work. Why did that not work? Okay, so I have 3 parts to today's presentation. Part 1 will comment on intergenerational research with the CVFS. Part 2 will repeat some content we talked about last year, but focus a little bit on the mental health measurement that was added to the CVFS. And finally, we'll link the 2 together with some analyses that link parental mental health to children's marriage and childbearing time. For intergenerational research with the CVFS, there's 4 points I'd like to make. One is about the whole family panel design. Another is the growth in opportunities for intergenerational research with the CVFS over time. The 3rd point will be about the new child health data, and the 4th point will be about the new transition into adulthood data. So on the whole family panel design topic, I want to take a minute to point out that there are relatively few longitudinal studies that actually follow whole families across time. The CVFS follows everyone in the household, including all parents, children, and siblings. It follows new households that split off from existing households as household fission occurs. CVFS adds anyone who marries a respondent or any child born to a respondent. This means that the CVFS grows over time, adding more and more family members as time passes. I'm sure someone on the team deserves credit for coming up with this graphic, and I'm sure it wasn't me, but I don't want to give anybody blame either. The idea is to demonstrate that we are able to look at relationships with all household members, spousal relationships, parent-child relationships, grandparent-grandchild relationships if they're in the same household, and sibling relationships if they're in the same household. Then my main point is that the CVFS is more than 28 years old now. This means that the CVFS has really become a very powerful resource for studying intergenerational influences. the CVFS children, who are now ages 15 to 25, are experiencing their own transitions to adulthood, including marriage and childbearing, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And those now 15 to 25 were all born after the CVFS was launched in 1995. So we have a lot of data about their communities, their households, their parents. I want to comment on a couple relatively recent sources of data. One is the new data on CVFS children and child health. This is a panel design from 1619 and 2022. Emily Trailhaven gave us a lovely webinar about this last year on January 12th, 2022. You can find this in the CVFS web page in the archive of, gosh, that must be 2023, I'm guessing, not 2022. Sorry. But you can look up Emily's webinar there and watch it. Like Heather said, they're all recorded. The other source I wanted to comment on that's new is the 2021 to 2024 panel study of transition into adulthood. We did describe the methods used for this in a previous webinar. Again, I'm guessing that was February 23, 2023, not 2022. Apologize for those errors. And I gave that one. And then we're also planning one this year that will focus more on the topics measured in that new panel study: substance use, sexual experiences, and contraceptive method choices. We'll be doing that this coming February 2024. And last but not least, I want to point out that the study has been used for important intergenerational research for a long time. Elise, great to see you here. Glad I led with you. There's a paper, but Elise Jennings led on the effect of parents' attitudes on sons' marriage timing, came out in American Sociological Review. There's another paper that Emily Smith Greenaway led. This is intergenerational in a little bit the other direction. It's offspring education, predicting parental mortality and the influence of kids on their parents. And then another one by Sarah Browner Otto on parents, marital quality, and their children's transition into adulthood. And that one's in demography. So these are coming out in good places, and there's room for plenty more. Next thing I'm going to cover, that's stopping point number one. Any quick questions of clarification about just intergenerational research design with CVFS in general before I move on to mental health? Okay. So my second area is talking about adding the mental health measures, the composite international diagnostic interview, to the CVFS. And we talked about this a little bit last year, but the motivation for adding mental health research to CVFS was partly to understand the health and well-being consequences of Nepal's armed conflict and of the 2015 earthquake. Another reason that we expanded the data collection this way was to expand the study of predictors of variation and change in mental health, particularly community, household, and family predictors that have not been possible to study with many of the other cross-sectional studies that were available on mental health worldwide. And finally, we want to take advantage of the CVFS whole family design to be able to study intergenerational topics like the one we're going to talk about today, spousal mental health topics, which we're not going to talk about today, and genetic topics that we'll have another webinar this year updating on some of the genetic work that's being done, but all those kind of topics. To do it, we drew on the composite international diagnostic interview. It's a survey instrument specially designed to generate diagnosis measures of mental disorders. It begins with screening items such as mood that's used in many other surveys, but it goes beyond those screening items to assess symptoms, duration, functional impairment, including behavioral, cognitive, or social impairments that are actually used to meet diagnostic criteria analogous to what a psychiatrist might diagnose in clinic. All interviewing is done with a standardized instrument that can be administered by lay interviewers to generate validated diagnoses. Wait, we went the wrong direction there. So for the composite international diagnostic interview, clinical validation of diagnosis is measured in the survey as a key test of the survey instrument's success. The validation is performed by having clinical professionals, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, or clinical social workers re-interview CD survey respondents and then test the comparison of results between this clinical re-interview and the survey interview. It's important to perform this validation in multiple languages and settings and directly with the target population, and this is an immense task, actually. The adaptation for Nepal had several steps over a period of years. The Nepal version of the World Mental Health Survey Initiative Composite International Diagnostic Interview started with a translation and cultural adaptation process. Because that translation and cultural adaptation was so effort intensive, we limited to a subset of only 8 of the CD diagnostic sections out of something like 30. The process nevertheless took us more than 3 years. And we built on lessons learned from earlier World Mental Health CD data collections in Asia, many of which had struggled with these issues of translation and cultural adaptation. CVFS has a couple special advantages for trying to make this sort of research work. One of them is that respondents had a 20+ year track record of high confidentiality within family privacy and protection from disclosure risks. So for example, for a couple decades, we have done interviews with both husbands and wives and done them at the same time, private, confidential, and asked them whether their spouse hits them or not. And they have experience with answering those questions and not having the answer shared with their spouse. So it's an example of the kind of privacy and confidentiality that are important to getting excellent quality measures of incapacitating mental health issues that would reach the level of disorders. The CVFS also has an existing staff and procedure successful in translation and adaptation for all the major Nepalese language and ethnic groups in Chitwan, and that was another important asset. Nevertheless, it was tough. One of the reasons it was tough is because of linguistic and cultural variations in recalling and reporting time. And that turns out to be crucial to understanding whether something that's normal, like you got down, felt kind of down, and whether that interfered with your daily life. Like, was it so bad you couldn't get out of bed? Was it so bad you couldn't eat? Was it so bad you couldn't go to work? Was it so bad you couldn't do your job? And how long did that last? Did it last for a couple days or a couple weeks? And that turns out to be really pivotal to reaching these thresholds for diagnosis. And we used iterative pilot studies, and we added a life history calendar. And I'm going to talk about the life history calendar just a little bit more. Everybody who knows CVFS knows that we've used life history calendars a lot for a lot of different things, but they're super helpful in trying to uncover these diagnosis level of impairment. That is an impairment that lasted for a couple weeks. It turns out that our validation at the end was highly successful, similar to the US and European populations, and that's a really big achievement for the CD, which has struggled with that in most Asian diaspora languages and cultures. So I decided to show this table today, partly because people have been confused by this table. It's in a paper. I have the citations at the end of the slideshow if you want to look them up once we put the slides online and so forth. And you can look it up and read about it. But what I'm doing here is asking the question. So these validation measures are, we do the survey interview, and then a clinician re-interviews the same human beings and reaches their own independent assessment of whether the person meets diagnostic criteria or not. And the first column results you see is a chi-square, which basically says there's a difference. If that chi-square is statistically significant, it means there is a difference between the survey measure and the clinical measure. And, first thing I want to show you is, yes, there's a difference, and there was in the United States too, okay? So it's not strange that there would be a difference. It's not a perfect measure. But what you'll also see is this area under the curve, or AUC measure of the size of that difference, is very similar for the United States and Nepal, exactly the same for major depressive disorder, and kappa, which is another measure of the difference between the two. Generalized anxiety disorder, the USCD did not have that measure, so we can't compare there. Alcohol use, they did. You'll see that the chi-square is bigger for Nepal by a bunch than the USA, but the area under the curve and the kappa are not terribly different. And then finally, for post-traumatic stress disorder, you'll see that there's this significant chi-square for the US and not for Nepal. And this is one of the few things that did get NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health's attention. And our program officer wrote to me and said, "How come, Bill?" And of course, we don't know because we didn't do a randomization of the United States and Nepal to the same CD. But you know, based on our conversation, dear God, I can see you on screen, so I'm looking at you when I say our conversation about what went on. We do believe that part of the reason PTSD validated really strongly in Nepal is because the armed conflict had been in the relatively recent past, and our data collection was about a year after the earthquake, and that the temporal proximity of those events helps the validation perform the same for both instruments for PTSD. As I think many of you joining us today know, retrospective reporting is always a challenge. It's cognitively challenging to recall the precise timing of events. We know that visual cues can provide assistance, which is one reason we use life history calendars. We know recall of more memorable events always helps people recall less memorable events. And we also know that traumatic events can be particularly difficult to remember because the brain doesn't encode the same way during a traumatic experience. Couple pictures. Gosh, Heather, I'm sorry, they look a little fuzzy on my screen. I hope they look pristine to everybody else, but these are our interviewers. Oh, the two things I want you to notice are a laptop sitting there. Laptop is the source for this composite international diagnostic interview. And a life history calendar is sitting there. And the life history calendar is being used by our interviewers to orient the respondents by asking them about their whole life history and the timing of events before we go on with the CD to ask about screening positive for disorders and so forth. Okay, back to another table. This is a table that I showed last year too, but I wanted to show it again because it's so important to the interpretation of these data. The top of the table is about screening for depression, generalized anxiety disorder, alcohol use disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. And screening is so important for two reasons. One is it's similar to a lot of sort of general survey questions about did you ever feel terrible? But it also is the gateway. That is, you have to screen positive in order to be asked all the questions about whether you reach diagnostic criteria or not. And what you see here is, so we did a random assignment experiment with and without the life history calendar to more than 1,000 cases on both sides. And what you see is with the life history calendar increases screening positive for depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder significantly. Not for alcohol use disorder. If we get time during the discussion, happy to come back and talk about alcohol use disorder and why it's different on both screening and diagnosis with and without the calendar. But you'll see below in that same table are the diagnosis measures. And again, you see that actually for diagnosing positive with depression, life history calendar makes a huge difference. For diagnosing positive with the generalized anxiety disorder makes a big difference, and even for PTSD almost doubles there, but with very little difference for alcohol use disorder. And the last thing I'm going to say about the calendar that I also believe is super important is our ability to measure potentially traumatic experiences or PTEs. Potentially traumatic experiences are an important trigger for episodes of mental disorder. And it's particularly important because 2 or more potentially traumatic experiences are known to be more likely to trigger mental disorder episodes than only one PTE. And you can see here that the life history calendar significantly increased the measure of any, significantly increased and by a lot the measure of 2 or more. And we think that's an important part of the data quality here. Okay. Heather, I'm ready for another pause in case anybody has questions of clarification about my relatively rapid summary of the methods used to add mental health measures to CVFS. I'll take the opportunity to sip. Okay. All right. So the next part is focusing on our main story, which is the independent associations between parental mental health and children's marriage and childbearing timing. I have 4 pieces to this section too. We'll talk about the motivation, talk a little bit about data linking. We'll talk about father's depression and marriage timing in a little bit of depth, and we'll talk about mother's depression and childbearing timing in a little bit of depth. So first of all, for motivation, a key piece of the motivation is that there's a high global burden of mental disorders worldwide. Prevalence of mental disorders is very high. About 1 in 5 adults experienced a common mental disorder in the last 12 months. Women are more likely to have mood and anxiety disorders. Men are more likely to have substance abuse disorders. But overall, the prevalence of mental disorders is high. Second piece is that mental disorders are stressors within the family environment. Role strains occur among spouses, parents, and children. There's also the potential for intergenerational transmission of mental illness within the family. And finally, there's an impact on family caregivers of these episodes of mental disorder. Third piece of the motivation is that families shape marriage and fertility behavior. I'm thrilled to see so many of you who've done work in these areas already, part of the worldwide demonstration across all kinds of settings that families are an important site of socialization, that parents' attitudes and preferences influence children's behavior, and that correlations of fertility behavior between parents and children are high, across siblings are high. So you put these 3 steps together in general, there's a high prevalence of mental disorders. Mental disorders are a strong stressor within the family, and families shape marriage and fertility behavior of kids many years later. And these are the key pieces of our motivation to do this work. Okay, motivated. Now we got to get into data linking. And those of you who've worked with CVFS data before know that it's great because there's a lot of different things you can link, and it's horrible because there's a lot of different things you can link. And the horrible is because there's a lot of choices and a lot of care that has to be taken and so forth. We're actually going to use 3 key pieces of data to link together. One is this mental health life histories that were collected in 2016 to 2018. And what's so important about them is not only this composite international diagnostic interviews, but also that the life history calendar was used, and the life history was used to get age of onset for each different mental disorder and the first occurrence, and that it occurred for all household members aged 15 to 59 in 2016, 2018. Next important piece is the CVFS relationship grid. And we're going to have a webinar on the relationship grid and data linking with it. And dear God, I don't know whose idea this was. That webinar appears to be scheduled for March 20, 2024. That turns out, you guys, to be my birthday, my 60th birthday for this all important webinar about the relationship grid. And it's kind of a funny thing because I am actually super proud of the various decisions that we made 3 decades ago about how to do this relationship grid. When I was in graduate school, a guy named Greg Duncan came to my course and talked about the PSID and explained to us what a household head was. And I remember thinking, how pissed would my mom be about there being a household head and it's only one person? Pretty darn pissed. And those of you who know her can corroborate that. And we made this decision that we wanted to measure the relationship of everybody in the household to everybody else in the household, no matter who they were. And that turns out to be a basis for being able to make not just kid to mom links, but kid to dad links. And so for every kid, we're able to link back to a mom and to a dad using these household relationship grid data. Finally, we're going to link together with the CVFS household registry data, which many of you have used. It provides us with monthly measures of did you get married or did you have a baby? And it does this for everybody who came into the registry, which includes all the kids who've been born to CVFS parents.
Bill, we have a question in the chat.
I wanted to keep going about linking, because if linking doesn't raise a question, nothing will. Yes.
So I can read it to you.
Thanks.
I wonder if children living together or children migrating away for work in cities, which of two has greater impacts on depression, anxiety, mental health disorder in mothers versus fathers?
Great question. Great question. So I don't know the answer, but I'm going to come back to that one, Heather, if we can keep track of it, to talk about, hey, all the great work that needs to be done here, because there's a lot of opportunities to do new work, and that's a great example of one of them. Well, let me talk about the work we have done, which is just scraping the very surface of what could be done with these data. And that's one reason I wanted to show it to you today, is so that others of you would become interested in doing some more of this work. I'm going to talk first about fathers' depression and their kids' marriage timing. And this is a funny kind of picture. I am taking here sons and daughters of adults who were measured in the composite international diagnostic interview that we collected in 16 to 18 that measures mental health. So these are sons and daughters of those people. And you'll see that we have a little bit more than 1,000 sons, a little bit less than 1,000 daughters. And then what I've got here is what fraction of them were married during our period of observation. That is, by the time observation stops, okay? We see about 32% of the sons were married, about 43% of the daughters were married. This is quite consistent with stuff, Scott, great to see you here while I'm talking about marriage in Nepal, but quite consistent with stuff that Scott showed a couple decades ago. No, it's not that long, is it? You're not that old. But you know, it's consistent with all around the world that, yes, it turns out girls, daughters marry younger than boys' sons in general on average. And then we have the parental mental disorders by sons and daughters, which turn out not to tell a very interesting story, and you kind of hope that, right? So about 5% of fathers had major depressive disorder, and that's 5% of fathers of sons and 5% of fathers of daughters. About 16, 17% of fathers had any other disorder, not major depressive disorder. About 27%, 26, 27% of mothers had major depressive disorder. Again, the newsflash, everywhere in the world, females are more likely to have major depressive disorder than males, and males are more likely to have substance use disorders than females in general. And then mothers with any other disorder, not major depressive disorder. And those are the descriptive statistics, not the main story, but just to orient you to the main story. This is the next step in the main story. And I'm gonna slow down just a smidge, okay? What we're estimating here is a discrete time hazard model of the hazard of first marriage, or the speed. It's estimated with a logistic regression, and the numbers that I have there inside the table are odds ratios. So I'm going to focus on the first one, which is 1.73, which means that sons with fathers who have major depressive disorder marry at 73% higher rates than sons whose fathers don't have major depressive disorder. And so what we see is a positive effect on the rate, which means marriage is happening faster for sons of fathers who have major depressive disorder. In the second model for sons, we control for, hey, did father have any other disorder, not major depressive disorder? And and two facts here. One is that any other disorder doesn't affect son's marriage timing, and it also doesn't change the effect of depression, major depressive disorder, on son's marriage timing. And in the last model that I show you here, we're going to add controls for mother had major depressive disorder and mother had any other disorder. And again, the story is, okay, that reduces the size of the association between father's major depressive disorder and son's marriage timing, but doesn't remove it. And interesting, you might say mother having major depressive disorder increases the rate of marriage some, but not statistically significant. Mother having any other disorder, also not statistically significant. In this version, the only other thing I'm controlling for right now is ethnic group. And so that these are independent of ethnicity, and these are for sons only. So in that sense, independent of gender. And I'll show you other controls shortly. Before I show you other controls, I'm going to switch to daughters. I'm going to show you exactly the same set of three models for daughters. Okay, so exactly the same models.
Another question in the chat, Bill.
Yeah, what's it say, Heather?
It says, what happens if a parent has serious chronic conditions such as skin cancer? I wonder how that impacts children's timing to marriage.
Yeah, that's another great
Maybe
question. Yeah, no, you guys, everybody's having the right reaction, which is, you see something interesting, you're like, wait, what about this? What about that? Exactly why I wanted to do this webinar at the beginning of this year and get others involved in this research, is because there's so many questions like that. Right now, we don't have any measures of chronic illness. I'll show you in a minute. We control for some other stuff that you would expect might be affected by chronic illness, like their educational attainment and their earnings and some stuff like that. But we don't have those controls in this model yet. Rather, the only switch I've made here is to show you daughters. You see that the direction of the effect of father's major depressive disorder is the same direction. You'll see that it's less than half the size, 30% increase, and you'll see it's not statistically significant. So a lot of us would call that no increase. You see that we add father had any other disorder. It changes the father, nothing becomes significant. Nothing is significant. We add mother's major depressive disorder and mother's any other disorder. And again, none of these different versions of parental mental disorders predict daughter's marriage timing, controlling for ethnicity. I'm going to keep going, but trust me, there's lots to talk about. Okay, now this is that same model, and I'm going to go back. Let's see if I get two tables. So model 3 here. I'm taking model 3, and now I'm going to throw a whole bunch of other covariates at that model. And the covariates are listed down below. So ethnicity, I said before, but now we're going to include parental education. And by the way, we're going to include both mom's educational attainment and dad's educational attainment, because both of them independently strongly predict kids' marriage timing. Parental marital experiences, how old were they get married? Did they get an arranged marriage or not? Household income, household assets, those kind of things. We've also done models with parental attitudes and the emotional quality of their relationship. And basically, you do these things and you can reduce the size of this effect of father had major depressive disorder, but you cannot make it go away. And that's the story from table 3. And I think I got one more to show you here. And this is because we also did another kind of experiment. We took that model, model 1 here controls for just ethnicity, model 2 controls for all the other stuff I showed you. We now add a control for the child achieved at least 10 years of schooling by age 15. And we just wanted to know, hey, how much of father's depression is really affecting the kid's educational attainment, and is the kid's educational attainment explaining what's going on here? The short answer is no, and we see that no sort of 2 ways here. One way you see that no is it does look like kids' educational attainment slows marriage, as Scott told us a few years ago. That's what's going to happen. But this effect of parental major depressive disorder does not go away in that model. In the next model, we control for all the other parental stuff, their education, both mom's education and dad's education turn out to be important here. When you control for those, the effect of the kid's own education becomes insignificant. And this effect size looks pretty much just like, model here we had 1.53, here we get it to be 1.55. If any of you think that's an important difference, then we need a different class on this, because we're not measuring a level of precision where that's an important difference.
Bill, in those models, do you remember what year the income and assets were measured in?
Yeah. We used 2006 measures of income and assets and 2008 measures of parental attitudes and parental marital history. And we did that because we were looking at kids who were basically experiencing marriage after 2008, between 2008 and 2018 to 20. So we wanted kind of exogenous measures of parental stuff. And Heather, I was going to stop here to take another question of clarification, which it sounds like that was, but I'll keep going.
Yep.
All right. Yeah. So I'm going to talk about mother's depression and childbearing timing next. And this one's going to get a little complicated in terms of the timing of measures. And so we're going to start with this vision of the daughter's childbearing timing. Daughter is born, daughter turns age 10, daughter gets married, daughter has a first birth. Look, in the United States, I wouldn't have put them in that order. In Nepal, still today, there's very little first birth happening before marriage, okay? Then there are these possibilities for when that daughter was exposed to her mother experiencing an episode of depression. And we're going to look at 3 time periods for this. First, we're going to look at, was the exposure to mother's depression before the kid was even born? Was the exposure to mother's depression while the kid was young, age 0 to 10? Emma did most of this work and also looked at 0 to 5, but we'll look at 0 to 10 here. Or was this kid not exposed to the mother experiencing depression until age 11 or more? And we're going to look at a couple different hazards of first birth. The first hazard we're going to look at is the hazard of first birth starting at age 10, ignoring the timing of marriage. So just like how long to your first birth, that sort of includes the process of getting married. Second one we're going to look at is the hazard from marriage. Okay, stop everything at marriage, and now let's look at the hazard from marriage to the first birth. Yeah, if this looks simple to anybody, it's not. Sorry about that. Okay, a few things about the sample characteristics for this analysis. We're going to look at 1,306 mother, father, daughter triads. 35% of those daughters had experienced marriage. 22% of them had experienced a first birth. 25% of them had experienced a mother who had major depressive disorder. Of those 329 who experienced major depressive disorder, if you look in the let's start in the blue part. 41% of those were before the daughter was even born. 38% were when the daughter was young, ages 0 to 10, and 21% when the daughter was older, ages 11 or over. Okay. I'm going to start slowly. Okay, so these are hazards beginning at age 10 of the daughter having a baby. Okay, first birth timing, daughter's first birth timing. First thing you notice is, quite like the marriage results I was showing you, mother has lifetime MDD, not a statistically significant effect. And the reason turns out to be because the timing matters. In the next 3 columns, you see one at a time, we introduce each of the different timing measures while controlling for whether the mother had ever had MDD. So the timing measure is really focused on timing of when it happens, okay? Now, what you see is in model 3, mother had MDD onset when child was age 0 to 10, has a really big, statistically significant effect on the daughter's first birth timing. To read that, 2.69 means 169% increase in the hazard of daughter's first birth, or increase in the speed of getting to that first birth. It's a big increase, it's statistically significant, and we can discuss this as we're almost done with slides. We can discuss it in our discussion period, but it turns out this is consistent with a bunch of important mechanisms, and including the impact of mother's depressive episodes in early childhood on child's educational success early in school, on child's own development of mental disorders, and also on child's attachment and particular issues with attachment. Okay, but this is the hazard ignoring marriage and when it occurs. Let me show you now the other hazard, which is beginning at marriage. And beginning at marriage, I want to show you that big effect that we saw before is much reduced. Of course, this is because a lot of the variation in how much, and the rate, the speed, is speed to get married as well as speed to have first baby, particularly in a setting where pregnant people are generally get married. But that's still statistically significant, even only examining this brief interval between marriage and the first birth, and it's a significant increase consistent with those same ideas I just mentioned. Okay, quick breath before I open it up. Archiving at ICPSR is underway. So the mental health measures, the composite international diagnostic interview, diagnoses, and screening measures are there. We have release A that has some demographics and those measures, both lifetime and 12-month. We're hoping available to you any day now. If you want to hear about it, sign up. And the code books for this stuff are already on our CVFS website. We hope to have a release B with more detail from the diagnostic interview available later this year. The conclusion I'm going to make before I open it up to discussion is these 4 points, okay? Intergenerational research is important anyway, and CVFS has grown into a really important resource for doing intergenerational research, and it's getting more important as time passes. We get to do more research with CVFS on intergenerational stuff as time passes. Second point is that the mental health measures demonstrate that parental mental disorders do have significant independent effects on children's marriage and childbearing. Not the end of the story, that's the beginning of the story, okay? That's to get us started. There's much more work to do with these new measures of mental health. Please join us. Would love to have more folks working on this. There's also much more work to do with CVFS on intergenerational topics in general, not just mental health. Again, please join us. Heather, I am now prepared to shut up and talk. Shut up and talk? That sounds wrong. Take questions.
We do have a question in the chat. Is
Thank
there
you.
any information on reasons for depression in parents?
In fact, sorry, I'm gonna go back to screen sharing for a second. Sorry. In fact, yes is part of the answer. Where were we? Here. And I'll just show you that in the slide deck. Let me see if I'll show you in the slide deck. I got a bunch of references for you in the slide deck, okay? One of them is this paper that Kate Scott led that is sort of summarizing the data findings from World Mental Health, or this composite international diagnostic interview in Nepal in general, published in Psych Medicine. I'll show you the prevalences, age distributions, key predictors, that kind of stuff. There's a bunch of stuff on marital experiences. Nepal turns out to be one of the few countries where the composite international diagnostic interview has been collected that shows that getting married increases the odds of major depressive disorder by about 3 times for women. Young Zhang and I have this paper on marital experiences and depression in Nepal that looks at how arranged marriage, but also being hit by your spouse. Turns out everybody finds that depressing, men and women both. It just happens a lot more to women than it does to men. And then we have this more recent paper on the transition to parenthood, opportunity to drink, drinking and alcohol use disorder that basically shows just like having a first birth increases depression for women, having a first birth in Nepal increases alcohol use disorder for men. We've got a bunch of community context stuff that's been done, both showing factors that increase depression and showing factors that are protective against depression. And then we have some stuff on the World Mental Health Consortium and some stuff on the Life History Calendar. And, I'll stop because everything that we know that's published is on the CVFS website. You can read down through the papers on the website there and our publications. Heather, we just had one come out today. The journal Addiction just released our new findings on community exposure to violence during childhood and how that increases alcohol use disorder among boys years later. And that one's not up there yet, but that kind of stuff, everything we know so far is there. There's lots more to study. I can see the chat now too, so that's good. But I could also, you could raise your hand or you could just talk. And I'll invite you if I said anything wrong to correct it while everybody's still here.
No, seems great. Thanks. I know it can be a complicated thing to explain. I've really struggled with that. So I thought you did a
now both of us have struggled with that because there's a lot going on in these models. To give you the 5-minute version is not straightforward.
If no one has questions, I can ask annoying minor technical questions, but we should talk about like big picture issues before I ask annoying.
Try ask an annoying one. Let's see if I can turn it into a big picture issue. Or
I imagine it's not a big deal, but for parents who have died, I'm guessing that there's a correlation between mental health disorders and mortality. So if you only got individual life history calendar data on mental illnesses, they're not here. Is that selection, or did you get some proxy reporting of that?
Yeah, I mean, this actually came up, Scott, as you might guess, in peer review of the proposals to collect the data. And it's interesting. My friend Susan Murphy always taught me that all samples of the living are biased. And so all of our research has a selection bias in it because we're only talking to living people. I don't think it just applies to mental health. I think it applies to every other thing we're going to study. In mental health, it came up because suicide is one of the ways that people make the transition from living to not living. And if suicide was a behavioral reaction to an episode of mental disorder, there's selection bias of those out. What we wrote in the proposal, which honestly I haven't pursued yet in papers, is that the household registry system death records do provide a source of information, not just on deaths, but about the reason why. And while I wouldn't trust those as like a medical record of was it emphysema or was it lung cancer or something like that, I wouldn't trust it for that. But was it suicide or not, I think it's pretty reliable. Dear God, at the time we wrote that proposal, I believe I wrote a sentence that said something like, and we have 6 suicides reported in the last, 10 years or something like that. It's a very, it's interesting. It's a low prevalence problem. Those severe cases of depression that lead to suicide tend to happen at younger ages. All of us who have teenagers know that it's something you get to worry about. And I think one interesting thing about teenagers is they usually haven't become parents yet. And so it's probably some selection bias out of parenthood entirely, But yeah, it's also potentially a selection bias. And here, you called it a small issue. I don't know. I think around the time I'm talking about less than 10 people out of 1,000, you're not going to worry about it statistically very much.
Yeah. 3 of them were alcohol use disorder out of 6. So
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. It definitely happens, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. My other annoying technical issue. Can you show the models on page 38 again? I guess I was confused by the parameterization of these. So are these dummy categories of these? And if so, what's the reference group? I guess I would have thought of doing these as like 4 exclusive categories and leaving one out as a reference. So I wasn't sure how that is. And then also for that third category of mother
Isn't that
had,
enough? I don't think you should say also before we resolve that.
oh, the other one, well, I guess the other question is if the last one is mother had an issue at 11 plus, if the mother had it, or at 10 plus, I forget what the third, yeah, at 11 plus, if the mother had that at, say, when the child was age 20, how can then you use that information to predict a hazard that's beginning at age 10? It seems like causal ordering is wrong there.
Yeah, so let me first deal with this, and this approach was suggested by Kate Scott, who's the clinical psychologist on our team, and I think all 3 of us demographers, Dirga, Emma, and myself, who did this work, fought with her about it, and yet she's quite convincing that really, and let's focus on model 3 for a second, right? So what's happening in model 3, and you can kind of see it in the numbers, right, Scott? If you compare model 3 to model 1, 2 things are happening. One, that overall effect that looks irrelevant in model 1, like so close to no effect at all that we can't, 0.99. How often do we get that? It becomes significantly negative when the 0 to 10 becomes significantly positive. That's because those 2 together account for everybody and give you the 0.99 average. And so it's a little bit like an interaction term, if you will. You're separating out this group and saying, okay, now the comparison of this group is to people who don't have depression, except that the comparison to moms who have depression is taken up by that first term in the model. And Emma, do you want to add anything to that interpretation?
I mean, I can add something. Scott, you're really hitting something that we've had a lot of internal discussions about. And actually, I've been working on revising this work, and we actually have added a model, like a model 5, that actually just uses these timing variables as kind of dummy indicators, as you had suggested. I think what these show is that we're kind of trying to isolate the timing in comparison to children whose mother's exposure was at any time. But so it's a really tricky thing, because I think the model 5 with the 3 dummy variables doesn't have this overall comparison. It just is comparing the different onset times to each other, whereas we were also trying to understand within kind of among children whose mothers ever developed depression, what is this specific isolated timing doing, or how is it behaving?
And in some sense, Emma, I think Scott's second question, which is, wait a second, if 11 plus includes age 20, what happened in the hazard?
Yeah.
I'm pretty confident the answer is, if it happened, it only gets to be in the hazard until once the kid gets married. So it's a discrete time with time-varying covariates.
Yeah, and I can comment on that too, Scott. You have make a really good point. If the onset is when the child is 20, they will still be in the 11 to 15 category, but it won't turn on until that age. So it is still accounting for the ordering, but that could maybe be a little clearer. But no, we're not turning on anything before that onset age is kind of matching.
Okay. No, this makes sense. It's just sort of strange. Most demographers might look at this and say, what's going on? An alternative would be having a single variable, mother ever had MDD, make it time varying, and then interact that with the baseline hazard.
Yeah, we
And
could
then
do
you can
that.
sort
So
of, yeah.
yeah, that's a good point. We haven't been doing kind of that continuous interactions. That might be a.
And the interesting thing too, Scott, is, and I get you on continuous, but when she estimated this for 0 to 5 instead of 0 to 10, that's an even bigger effect. And so what's happening here is it's really, sorry, those who don't already know this about depression, there's a thing called postpartum depression that's actually, right after you have a baby. And it might last for a while, but it occurs in this period of 0 to something. and that's a very common form of depression that that women experience. And so what's interesting about it is that may have a particularly powerful effect on these kids' young formative years. And so it is like the difference between mom having depression before the kid's even born doesn't sound like a continuous thing to me. Sorry. I mean, you're right. There's a lot of different ways we should consider this with different conceptualizations. But this is sort of a discretized when the kid is young, where 0 to 10 gives you more years of exposure to being young, but actually has a weaker effect than if we narrow that. And I think it's kind of indicative of the amount of work that one could do on these topics, because there are a lot of interesting nuances that are probably different for different outcomes. I mean, just so you know, we explored these timing measures for the hazards of marriage, and it doesn't work this way. Father's alcohol use disorder is a different thing than father's major depressive disorder, and so on and so forth. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. Or sorry, a lot of cool things we could be working on here. And I want to redouble my invitation to join us, and then be reminded by Heather that we're very conscious of people's schedules and time and don't want to run over.
It's 3 o'clock. Yep.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you do have questions, please write to us. If you'd like to get more involved with the data, please do. Thank you.